PHP functions. Oftentimes you're going to have some code that you want to execute over and over again. Well, instead of having to type that code over and over again whenever you want that to happen, it's better to just encapsulate it inside of a function. A function is simply a piece of PHP code that you can call, and it may or may not have parameters or arguments that you send to it, and it may or may not return some information. And so most functions have meaningful names, and it simply gives us code reuse. So in this nugget, we're first of all going to talk about user-defined functions. We already have a bunch of predefined functions, and I've already shown you where to find those. So with our user-defined functions, I'll show you the syntax of how to create those, and then how to give arguments. And there's several different types of arguments that you can provide. You can also give default arguments, and you have the choice between giving a single argument or collection arguments, such as a list. And we also have several ways of returning values. For example, if we have a mortgage calculator, it might take in some information such as the amount that you're borrowing and the interest rate and the term. Well, the return value might be how much your monthly payment is going to be. With return values, we can also do neat things like print things out with an echo statement. We can have a little bit more advanced functions. For example, if you want to have recursive functions that keeps calling itself over and over again, or if you want to have embedded functions, that's where you've got a function that's actually defined within another function. And then the last thing we'll talk about are our variable functions. Variable functions will help you create callback functions when we're dealing with object-oriented PHP in our next nugget. So let's first of all talk about creating our own user-defined functions. The syntax for creating a function is really simple. All you need to do is somewhere in your code you say function and then the function name. In this case I called mine NL for new line, followed by parentheses. Now if your function takes arguments, then great, put those arguments in those parentheses. If it doesn't take any arguments, then just leave it blank inside. Then you're going to have curly braces which encapsulate all of the function code. So my simple function here is simply echoing the BR tag. Well, why would I want to create this function? Well, in PHP, a lot of times I want to splash a BR tag to the browser. And I find it to be really cumbersome to always type in echo, double quote, BR, and so on. So now whenever I want to call this code, I simply call it by saying NL, followed by the parentheses, and a semicolon. That essentially executes this code in here. Let me show you another example of a function. This one is actually going to take some arguments and return something as well. I'm going to call my function add nums. And all it's going to do is add two numbers together. So I'm going to have it add my $A and $B. And all I have to do in my return statement is say return $A plus $B. So now if I wanted to call this, it would be pretty easy. Somewhere in my code, after I declare my function, I can say print add nums, and this is where I actually pass in two numbers. For example, let's see what 3 and 4 is. Just like that. Now your code will probably have some more intricate logic inside of the body, but that's really the gist of how these functions work. Let's actually test this in our browser. So here I have some skeleton code. Right now it just has the title that says functions. You'll see that my file is called functions.php. Now it's considered a best practice to declare your functions first in your PHP and then call the functions. Or if you want, you can declare all your functions in a separate PHP file. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. So here I'm going to have my function called NL. And remember, all that does is echo the BR tag. And then I might have my other function called add nums that adds my A and B together. Well, let's test this out now. We have two choices. We can either say print or echo. The difference between these two built-in functions is that echo can actually take a number of arguments. It can take a list of strings that you want to print out, whereas the print statement can only take one argument. Well, if I want to print out the add nums followed by a br tag followed by add nums again, my best option is to say echo add nums, and I'm going to add 1 and 1. Then I can just simply put a comma there, followed by a new line. See, I'm calling my function again. And then I can say add nums again, this time adding 5 and 5. Okay, and you can continue on and on like this, just like that. Remember, if you were to use the word print here, it would not work. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and let's test this in our browser. Okay, so I'm just going to hit refresh, and there we go. Let's look at some more function examples. Now, by default, when you're passing arguments to a function, it gets passed by value. What that means is a copy of the value is actually getting sent. Let's say that you have a function called giveRaise, and you pass into that function a raise amount. And in here, you would also want to include the original amount, in other words, the salary. So really, you're passing in two arguments, the salary and the raise amount. Now, let's also put some code in here that says that the salary is equal to the salary plus the raise amount. The shorthand way of doing that is to use the plus equals operator, just like that. Okay, so now, let's assume that my salary is equal to 80,000. And now I call this function giveRaise. And I'm going to pass in my salary as well as my $10,000 raise. What do you think my salary is now going to be? Well, let's print it out. Let's do print my new salary is equal to $my_sal. You'll get some unexpected results here. Let's save this and execute it in our browser. My new salary is 80,000. That too is from the previous execution. We can put a new line in there to make it a little nicer looking. In other words, I can just do a new line call function. Save it again. Okay, we didn't get our raise. We started off with 80,000. I thought we were giving ourselves a $10,000 raise. Well, I'll explain why you didn't really get the raise. When we passed in $my_sal, just a copy of this 80,000 was sent to the function. When the function was called over here, it didn't actually affect the original $my_sal. So that's what passing by value is. Now, if you want to pass by reference, all you need to do is put an ampersand in the function parameter right before the parameter right there. Okay? So now that we're passing by reference, let's see what happens. Essentially, we're passing a reference to this variable in here, and we are affecting it. Okay, so let's save it again and refresh. Ah, there we go. You see the difference in behavior? Now, let's also talk about default arguments. With MySQL, you can give default arguments, and the way you do that, it's pretty simple. You simply put in the parameter area, to the right-hand side of your parameter, you put in equals, and then whatever the value is. So if I want to make my default raise amount be 1,000, I can do that. The important thing is that if you have multiple parameters in here, make sure that your default arguments go last in order. That way, when you're calling the function, you're going to provide the required parameters first, and then if you want to leave off the default parameters, that's fine, and it'll just go to their defaulted values. For example, here my original salary is 80,000. If I just say give raise and not even provide the raise amount, let's save this and let's re-execute this. Just hit your refresh button. Okay, so see how I have 81,000? We used positional parameters when we called our function. What that means is when we called our parameters, we just gave the parameters in order that they appeared in the function declaration. For example, in my add nums function, I can give a default value of 0 for A and a default value of 0 for B as well. Now when I call this, if I just want to provide b, I can do that. For example, in this add nums right here, instead of just passing in 2 and 3, I can say $b equals 5. I've overridden any positional parameters. In other words, the $a is just going to default to 0. So let's save this and re-execute it. Okay, it looks great. PHP 4 and above actually has support for variable length arguments. For example, if you have a function called addNums and you're not sure how many numbers you want to add together, well, with PHP 4 and above, you can send in as many numbers as you want to. And then there are built-in PHP functions that help us determine how many elements were passed in. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so here we have function numargs. This does not take any parameters, and it just gives us an integer. It tells us how many arguments were passed in through the function. We also have function getargs, which gives us the list of the arguments that were passed in. And then we have a third function called function getarg, where you actually pass in the index number of the element. So to see this in action, let's go ahead and modify our addNums function. What's interesting about this is when we're using variable length parameters, we don't even have to put anything in there. Okay, we can just leave the parameter list blank in the function definition. Now I'm going to get rid of this return $a plus b. We'll put in a different return statement in just a moment. Okay, so I can create a variable, let's just call it c. I'll say $C equals function num args. Okay, so if I pass in 4 arguments, my $C is equal to 4. If I pass in 50 arguments, it'll be equal to 50. Now I can create a for loop. I can say for, and I'll have a counter. I'll call my counter I. I'll say for I is equal to 0, I is less than C, I plus plus, and inside of here we want to sum up our numbers. So I can create a variable called sum. It's considered a best practice to actually declare it up here and initialize it to 0. Sum is equal to 0. And here we can say sum is equal to sum plus, and then whatever parameter was passed in. So how are we going to access these values? Well, we simply say func get arg, and we pass in our counter. So the first time around, my $I is equal to 0. With our arrays, we start counting at subscript 0. So this is correct. Okay, so now we of course need to return the sum at the end here. So this is where we say return $sum. Now let's test it. Down here we made calls to add nums. We passed in 1 and 1, that'll still be 2. We passed in 5 and 5. Let's modify this a little bit. Let's just pass in another 5 right there. And this third call to add nums is not going to work anymore because our $B parameter is now gone. Let's pass in some different arguments. We'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, let's save it and test it. Refresh. Looks perfect. Let's talk more about returning values from a function. When you have a return statement in a function, it's actually taking the control away from the function, and now the control of the program automatically goes to the point where you called the function. And it's important to remember that you might have multiple return statements within your function. In other words, it doesn't have to be the last statement in your function. For example, you might have an if-else statement with several conditions that you're checking, where you can have different kinds of branching depending on what variables are set. Now usually the value that you're returning from a function is going to be a scalar value. In other words, it only holds a single value. If you need to return multiple values, you'll have to do it by returning an array. I'll give you an example with raises. Let's say we want to create another function called give raises. And in this case, we're passing in an array of salaries, and we're also passing in a raise percentage. For example, if you want to give a group of people an 8% raise, not a problem. In this case, my first argument, I'll make it an array. We don't explicitly have to declare right here that it's an array. It's when we actually call the function that we pass in an array. So I'm going to say ampersand, because we're going to pass by reference the salaries, and also $R for the raise percentage, or I'll call this $RP for raise percentage. Okay, just like that. Let's make sure we don't forget our $sign right here. And now inside here, we're going to have a for each loop to loop through the elements in our array. So we'll say for each $sals as $V. So what's going to happen in this for each loop is every time we loop through our salaries right here, the individual value is going to be $V. Now we're going to be modifying $V, and so once again we want to pass by reference. So make sure you put the ampersand right there. Now we can perform the calculation. We can say our $V is equal to $V plus whatever that raise amount is. Okay, so here we can say $V times $RP divided by 100. Now to call this, we can simply scroll down here and let's just test it right here. We'll say we've got some salaries is equal to an array. See, this is where we declare that it's an array. And let's say we have 60,000, 70,000, and 80,000. Okay, now we can call our function. Give raises. What are we passing in? Well, we're passing in our salaries. And let's give an 8% raise. So we'll say 8.0. Or you could simply say 8, doesn't matter. And then at that point, if you wanted to print out the salaries, the easiest way to do that is to use, remember the join function with the raise? You can say print join, and the first argument is how we want to separate our elements when it's getting printed to the screen. So for example, we can separate them by commas. And then we say salaries. And now just to clean up some of this so our output looks a little bit better, I'll comment out some of these. I'll get rid of this echo statement right here. And now we can save this and go to our browser and test it. So we can refresh, and those are our salaries. Everyone got their 8% raise. Don't forget that when you're passing by reference, prepend the variable name with an ampersand. With functions, we can also implement recursion, which you can do with a lot of different programming languages. Recursion is simply when you have a function that calls itself over and over again for a certain number of times. One example might be if you have a factorial function. The only thing you need to be cautious about with recursive functions in PHP is the number of times that the function calls itself. According to PHP's official documentation, if it calls itself more than about 100 times, then you could end up in some trouble. So make sure it's a manageable number of recursions. So let's do an example of factorial calling itself. Okay, so I'm going to create my function right up here, and I'll just call mine fact, and it's going to take a number. I'll just give this x. Okay, so inside here, I want to make sure that my x is not less than 1. And the reason why is, remember, factorial is x times x minus 1 times x minus 1, and so on. So we can put a statement in here that just says, if our $x is less than or equal to 1, then we're going to return x. Now, let's deal with x if it's greater than 1. So now down here, we simply say fact. And what are we going to pass in? Well, we're going to say $x minus 1, because we do want to decrease our x, times $x. And let's make sure that we put our return statement right here. So down here, we can do an echo, and let's put in a new line character so it doesn't run into the other lines. And then we'll say fact of 4. So this should be 24. And another new line character. Save it, and refresh. Okay. We know now that this factorial function works. If you wanted to add more intricate code, for example, ensuring that it's indeed an integer that you're passing in, or that the number that you passed in isn't greater than 100, you can do that. Now with PHP, it is possible to embed a function definition inside of another function. And the behavior of this is very different from a lot of other programming languages such as Java. The difference is, even though a function might be embedded, it's still global to the rest of the application. For example, if you have an embedded function, it can still be called from outside of the functions. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about are variable functions, which can be pretty useful when you're dealing with object-oriented programming. A variable function is simply where you assign a function name to a variable, and then you can call that function by using the variable name. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so here we have our factorial function right up here. I can say down here that my I'll give my variable name anything, any name I want to. I'll just say XYZ. $XYZ equals, and then in quotes, the name of the function. Just like that. And so now I can call my $XYZ as if it were the function name. For example, I can say echo $XYZ and pass in a number. So this is essentially calling factorial with an argument of 5. Now I'm going to put some new line characters before and after this just so it looks nice. Just like that. Let's test this. Refresh it. And there we go. There's our 120, which is 5 factorial. Now, why would we even want to have another name for a function? Well, this is going to prove very useful when we get into object-oriented programming, which we'll save for our next nugget. Let's review what we've learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about defining your own functions. These are user-defined functions. Make sure you have the keyword function, followed by the required parentheses, and then curly braces to hold the actual code. Then we talked about arguments. You can have default arguments by using the equals operator inside of the parameter list. You can also pass arguments by reference instead of by value by prepending that ampersand. And then you can also, in PHP 4 and 5, provide variable length arguments using those 3 functions we talked about to obtain the number of arguments and what those actual args are. We also talked about returning values. If you want to return a scalar, that's great. If you want to return an array, just make sure that you use the keyword array, or you can return a variable that stores an array. A function can call itself numerous times. This is a recursive function. Just make sure that you have some kind of exit condition so you don't end up with an infinite loop. Then we also have embedded functions. Remember that embedded functions are just functions that are declared inside of other functions, and they are global. They can be accessed by outside calls. And then the last thing we talked about are variable functions, where you simply take a variable and you assign to it the name of a function. And we will talk more about that in our object-oriented programming nugget. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.